and strong coffee. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it can be higher. You can add one more pole to it, and when I first set it up, I'm like, that's too high. So, but yeah, it works great. $50. Well, good morning, and welcome to historic St. Paul's Episcopal Church for a Sacred Ground pilgrimage. We are the oldest church in the diocese. You'll hear more about us, but welcome to our 175th anniversary year. The celebration in August of our 175th is coming up. It's on your calendar because I gave it to Jackie like 2.5 years ago. Because I know Bishop's calendars. So on Sunday, August 18th, which is 2 days after the official anniversary date, we will have Bishop Megan with us, and we'll throw a big party and celebrate a mass and probably have confirmations. We'll do it upright. Then in September, we're having a wide open church or wide open walls event. It will be from like 8:30 in the morning and run all day. We'll probably open it with morning prayer from the historic prayer book that was in use 175 years ago, and close it with something much more modern. But in between that, there will be music of all types: organ music, all Baroque music, Celtic music, Eastern European music. Yeah, we've got a whole lineup of folks coming here. So there's save the date cards. Wanted to make sure you know about that. You know where the food is at this point: food, coffee. If you have coffee, you need restrooms. Just fact of life. So there are 2 restrooms in the building. If you go down this back passage, there's a door and it goes straight into a small restroom, pretty much. If you go down the center aisle, turn right, just a little jog to the left, there's another bathroom. So there are 2 bathrooms in the building. If we needed a third one, there's one in the parish hall. But a note about Saturdays at St. Paul's. Saturdays we feed people. So we have our sack lunch distribution program that starts at 11 o'clock. They will be in the parish hall. So they might wander in here, that's fine. So just to let you know that around 11 o'clock, there'll be a lot of people. Sometimes we have up to 30 people, and several of them waiting for us by about 10:30. And because we were open early today, they were like, "Are you already open?" so just a heads up on that. So hopefully you found the agenda. We will be doing a litany, a social penance at the very end. That's out there, and we'll have time to get that. There is a short history of St. Paul's printed up. If I run out, I can get more. And then there's some information about Sutter's Fort and the California Museum. So with that, again, welcome to St. Paul's, and I will turn it over to Bishop Megan for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much. It is lovely to have a chance to be with everybody here in this historic church, and to have a chance to dive into some of our history and the history of Sacramento in its broader and deeper sense. And that's one of the things that we are going to take the time to do today. But I thought that we should begin with prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, you declare your glory and show forth your handiwork in the heavens and in the earth. Deliver us in our various occupations from the service of self alone, that we may do the work you give us to do in truth and beauty and for the common good, for the sake of Christ who came among us as one who serves, your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Well, this is part of the opening days of our great revival. It is something that we've been preparing for a long time. Our revival, which is all about fearless faith, planting love, and harvesting hope. And we have several main themes in our revival. And one of them is racial reconciliation. So I am so glad that we are doing some of that all wrapped up in history, because that's always a critical part of that. And I'd like to acknowledge that we've got amazing speakers and leaders here in this place. Particular appreciation to the CIM for the amazing work that you guys have been doing. There you are. I see you, Joanne. In the back, also part of our crew that's been doing amazing work and continues to do it. One of the things I like about what we're going to be doing today is that we get to look a little bit at the sort of the unknown history of what has happened in our Sacramento area in one of our redevelopments. And it's definitely information I didn't know about, so I am interested in it. One of my hopes as we do this racial reconciliation is that we may surface not only the places where we have gone seriously wrong, right? There's no end of those spots in human history, and that includes our history, but it's our history, so we're the ones who are delving into it. But I think that it also shows us some bright spots, some spots that are really worthy of celebration that we just did not know about. Right, so we hear about a vibrant community that was all lined up sort of in the corridor of our capital. And on one hand, there's a lot of sorrow about what happened. But on the other hand, I'm actually really excited to hear about a vibrant community, what was happening, what was the life. I get to imagine the richness of it, the texture, and that frankly is one of the happy byproducts of this, is to realize that there is more going on in our history than we knew, more good news, more connectivity, more vibrance, and that's not what I originally thought we'd be uncovering when we did some of our historical examination. But it turns out that as you lift up that rock, you see multiple things, and some of it is great stories about people's lives. So I love that we're going to recover some of those. I hope that would be a theme as much as anything else as we move forward, because these are our stories that maybe are unknown to our community, and we should be rejoicing in them as well. So one of my favorite scripture passages is from Colossians, and it talks about Jesus. It says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." It is in the power of that promise that we make this exploration. In Christ, all things hold together. Things that we are aware of and that we are just now becoming aware of have always been in his hands, and he has always been holding those broken pieces, the joy and the sorrow of them, all together. And that is what gives us hope. It's what gives us courage. It's what gives us the ability to engage in some of this work. I'm looking at the rest of my quote here. Hold on. It says, "For God was pleased to have all of his fullness to dwell in Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross." And so that's our hope. That is why we as a Christian community are engaging in this. This is why our different congregations have been engaging in this, with sacred ground, with book studies, with walks, with pilgrimages like we're doing here at one of our historic churches. It's because we have got that hope that Christ is holding all things together. And there's nothing we can discover that would ultimately lose his grasp on us, our history, our hope, or the hope and the promise of reconciliation. So it is in that hope of reconciliation. It is in trusting that it is Christ who still holds all things together that we, with great courage, in our season of courage, explore and step out to find out more about the history of our beloved town here, starting with our most beloved church. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bishop Megan. And I use the headset because I walk around too much. So again, welcome to St. Paul's on this, yet again, rainy Saturday. So I'm going to talk a bit about St. Paul's history. There's 175 years of it, so I'm not going to touch everything, just some high points and some low points. Because history is a mix. We tend to want to, especially with the 175th celebration, talk about all the good stuff. But as Bishop Megan said, there are some things that in our history that probably are not so good that we tend not to talk about. Oh, and because I know myself, start the timer. There we go. The first thing I want to acknowledge is we are standing and sitting on indigenous lands. Lands that were never ceded over to us, lands that were stolen. And so, come on, there we go. So as part of our 175th anniversary year is the desire to develop a land acknowledgement statement. And it gets complicated, as you will see shortly. Our first services were held in what's now Old Sac, which, according to the Indigenous Native Lands map, were likely the ancestral homes of several folks, the Patwin, Miwok, and Nisenan. Our first and second buildings, Miwok and Nisenan. This building, same thing. It's a spot in here because we are close to the rivers where several tribal First Peoples had settlements. So we need to acknowledge that. I recently returned from a trip to New Zealand, and every time we met with folks and had presentations, they acknowledged the First Peoples. And I think that's so important to remember that those people have wisdom to share with us. So we are the first congregation established in Sacramento. Our first service was held in August in 1849, and somewhere in that area. That is actually a painting from 1849 of what Sacramento looked like. Flooded all the time, fires, the usual stuff. The first meeting was actually, we had church on August 16th. We don't know exactly for sure the date because of a lot of the records were destroyed by fires. But we do know that it took a couple of days to get to Sacramento. So the priest came up from San Francisco, held the service. The next day, the church was established. The meeting was presided over actually by the mayor of the town, which was just barely established at that time. So our first building was called Grace Church, and it was on I Street at 10th and I, where if you know Sacramento, there's a county building where the courts are across the street from that. So roughly in that area. So that was our first building. It was a brick edifice capable of seating 300 people and cost about $15,000 at the time. So but things happen. And you'll find out as I go on in this presentation that we've had several buildings. I just want to mention some of the prominent early members of this congregation. As I said, the mayor, Mayor Wynn, presided over the organization of Grace Church. He was also at times president of the Oddfellows and the general of the state militia. State militia has some problems, of course. H.E. Robinson, merchant, postmaster, state senator in the first legislature of California, the guy who owned the first grocery store. That's an important thing. We like to feed people around here. And then in the Sacramento Union in 1903 commented that among prominent men who have been connected with St. Paul's Parish as vestrymen or members of the congregation included, you see, Leland Stanford, C.P. Huntington, Town, and the Crocker family. So lots of people. So that brings us to one of those rocks we need to uncover, sort of the historical racism that is built in to our history that we tend not to think about. As I said, early members included founders of the Transcontinental Railroad. And that railroad was built literally on the backs of Chinese labor. And with the Chinese labor, we end up with the legislature passing the Chinese Exclusion Act so that they could not purchase land. Brought over here to work, make lots of money for the Crockers, the Stanfords, and Huntingtons. Leland Stanford. Leland Stanford was, of course, our governor. Lovely picture of him rowing his boat across floodwaters from his mansion to the state capitol to be inaugurated. But Leland Stanford literally hired militias to hunt and kill Native Americans. As I said, land acknowledgement for this congregation is complicated. This congregation during the Civil War was, according to the histories we've uncovered, had a large Southern sympathizing congregation. Their rector was a Northerner who managed, with the help of the presiding bishop, to find ways to keep the congregation together during the Civil War. And then, of course, because we have had prominent members in our community, they were likely involved in some of the redevelopment of Sacramento, large portions of which were driven by racism. You will hear William Berg in a little while, who's the president of Sacramento Preservation Sacramento, talk about one of those redevelopments on the West End. Great story. But there's more than that. The freeways placement in Sacramento were done to break up communities. Business 80, as it's now known, that comes between W and X streets, that was a vibrant Japanese community. It cut them in half. And that's why the Buddhist temple is right next to the freeway. So things like that, we don't think about those a lot. But how we placed freeways literally were done to cut communities in half. So we'll get to some other high points here. So I mentioned our first building, showed a picture of it. It didn't last too long Between fires and floods, by 1871, they had to abandon the first church because the walls were bulging. The foundations were crumbling. And on top of that, the city was fortifying itself against flooding in Sacramento and was literally raising the streets a full story. So just west of us, the streets are all like 8 to 10 feet higher than they originally were. And they also, by the way, moved the American River because why not? So they built a second building. And Bishop Kipp laid that cornerstone in 1871, or at least helped. And they built another huge building. And there's a picture of it. Wonderful. The pipe organ was written up, everything, and some of the prominent families started giving lovely things. We had the Crocker Memorial window that Mrs. Charles Crocker donated to the church. That was Faith, Hope, and Charity, and unfortunately, the best picture we have of it is this one over here. Not the greatest. Unfortunately, that window was destroyed in a fire in 1914, and the church bought Faith, Hope, and Charity over on the side. The other memorial window is the Stanford Memorial window, which is still in existence over here. If you haven't seen it, I commend it to you. It is the life, death, and resurrection of Leland Stanford Jr., literally, with the host of heaven opened up to greet him. He died at a young age on a trip to Europe. And as you know, his mother, it was his mother. It's interesting, the women in this story. His mother gave it's a mother's gift. His mother actually commissioned the window from Pacific Art Glass Company of San Francisco, which was the Tiffany of the West Coast. The Crocker window was the same company, and that was the high altar window. And I'll get to that window too. It's got an interesting story. So that gets us to this building. So that building was built on the foundations of the building that had foundation problems that caused the brick walls to buckle. So by 1900, it was falling down. So they took it down. They took it down and built this one. This is a significant building. It was designed by Willis Polk, who was working for a Burnham architecture firm in Chicago and starting a company out here. Willis Polk built and designed much of post-earthquake San Francisco's significant buildings. The other building, and there's several other buildings he designed in town. The other one that's close by is now the old spaghetti factory, the old train depot. There's some problems with this building that we need to also notice. The parish contracted with Folsom Prison to have the prisoners quarry the granite. We found documentation of that now. So, literally, prison hard labor quarried the stone for this building. The building was started in 1904, took them until 1909 to complete it. And it's interesting, on top of the stone there was I read an article about, so this church didn't have any cost except transportation for the stone because it was a prison project. They just had to transport it. Well, we've got this railroad history. So at the dedication of the building, they said, our thanks are due to the Southern Pacific Company, who largely donated the freight charges because of the fact that the Reverend Orlando Harriman, father of the railroad president, was once rector here. That's how deep our ties are to the railroads. And then we thank the Jewish merchants, the Roman Catholic bishops, and the Sacramento public, without distinction of creed, have built this church, and we invite them to claim it and use it. So interesting acknowledgement of what it took to build this building between 1904 and 1909. They just about got everything settled in here, and they had a fire. Started in the organ. The fire department came through the high altar window. That was the Crocker Memorial. And This church looks a lot different than it did in that night because of that. It was robbed stone on the inside, so they plastered it, changed the way this all looks, and bought a third-hand pipe organ that started its life as a chapel organ for the College of William and Mary. So the organ is an 1877 tracker action organ that is restored to pretty much the original specifications and is used every Sunday, and about 3 or 4 times a week somebody comes in to practice on it. So that's good. What they did with the wood from the second building, was to build a 2-story parish hall on what's now the parking lot and double-wide parish hall. Unfortunately, in 1964, on Easter Eve, it had a fire. I sort of wonder what happens on Easter Eve that might have caused a fire. I don't want to think about it. Because it was 1964 and the congregation was very small, Bishop Hayden refused to sign the loan papers so that they could do the code upgrades that were required. Insurance would have covered the roof, but the code upgrades, and so it was torn down. It is too bad. So, I mentioned that Grace Church was established and we're St. Paul's. How did that happen? Well, we've had several names. One of the things that happened, of course, in Sacramento is that after the gold rush, the Crockers, Stanfords, and others fled Sacramento and went to San Francisco to have mansion building contests, literally. So a lot of the money went. So in 1877, with building number 2, Grace Church went bankrupt. This unfinished second building was repossessed by the bank, and it looked like the first congregation in Northern California, the Diocese of Northern California, the second in California, was going under. Some of the members got together, petitioned to establish something called St. Paul's Episcopal Church, the continuing congregation. And then the women, thank you, women of the church, the women got together and raised a lot of money and bought back the mortgage. So that's amazing. So that was reorganized. During the Great Depression, St. Paul's and Trinity were merged. Trinity became basically a USO chapel, and we had in this small church a bishop, a dean, and a rector. What could go wrong with that? So it was known as Christ Church Cathedral from 34 to 46. During that time, another church was born from St. Paul's. Trinity was born from St. Paul's. All Saints. The bishop said no more churches in the city limits, and so just across the street from the city limits, All Saints was born. 3 alpha male rector, dean, bishops. That didn't work too well. Then in the 1960s, with urban flight and other things, the church really declined, and St. Paul's Center was born because of the social outreach work. And so St. Paul's Center was born. And then in 1979, we were established as a mission. And then in 1988, back to a parish. So we've been all over the place. But we stayed with it. Women at St. Paul's. Huge thread of women doing great things around here. As I say, without the women of St. Paul's, I don't think the buildings would have been complete, because they're the ones that helped raise funds. It wasn't Leland Stanford who gave the window, it was Jane Stanford. It wasn't Charles Crocker who gave the window, it was Mrs. Charles Crocker. St. Paul's had a chapter of the Daughters of the King, the St. Agnes chapter, and in a 1894 book by the Sacramento Bee, they talk about the St. Agnes chapter, Daughter Kings, they say the Daughters of the King St. Agnes chapter of St. Paul's Episcopal Church are doing praiseworthy work in assisting the poor. Great things. As I mentioned, Mrs. Crocker and Mrs. Stanford donated significant windows. And then another thing we found out just recently is that the high altar window was designed by Wilhelmina Orgotop, who was the principal designer at Cummings Art Glass Studios in San Francisco from 1928 to 1953. Her granddaughter visited us last year. She designed something like 500 or 800 windows for Cummings Art Glass. And was the first woman head designer for a glass company west of the Mississippi. And she did the central ascension panel and then the top. The two side panels were not put in until much later, and then it became a teaching window, so you on that. But again, wonderful things. The current emergence of the diaconate in this diocese was basically also born at St. Paul's. Tina Campbell, who will be speaking in a little while, received here, married here, called to be a deacon here, ordained here. One of the stories of St. Paul's is also music and arts. As I mentioned, for our anniversary, we are going to have a whole day that has a lot of music in it, because music's been important here. The Grateful Dead played in this building. Honest to God, the Grateful Dead played here. In 1968, somehow, pre-computers, Memorial Auditorium got double booked. And the rector's like, yeah, come on over. No problem. So the Grateful Dead played here. Many, many, many organ recitals have happened here from some very prominent organists. Some you may remember E. Power Biggs, who literally went around the world recording on historic organs. He played here to raise funds to restore this organ. And then after the parish hall burned down, we had this parking lot. So why not bring the circus to town? So for several years, we had the Royal Liechtenstein Circus perform in the parking lot here. Wow, crazy things, crazy things. And then in 1968, Lee Page, who was rector here, started a little thing in here called Homefront inside the church. Yeah, I'm going to have to go talk a lot faster, aren't I? And they brought all kinds of musical acts in here, poetry readings. It was quite the happening place. And Lee Page also, for those of you in Sacramento, started Weatherstone Coffee. Rumors of our death have happened multiple times. In the 1960s, we nearly closed. We became primarily a social outreach organization, St. Paul's Center for Urban Ministries. Cubicles lined the walls. So if you look around, you'll notice like commercial grade plugs around the sides. That's because there were cubicles there, cubicles in the back. And there's a lovely picture with David Myers in the Cube Farm. So if you can imagine it. The social outreach programs, though, created all kinds of ministries. The food bank that was here became River City Food Bank. It continues. The free senior reassurance program, where we call seniors, is still going on. It's run by Eschaton now. So during services, the altar on wheels would come out, and you'd hear the phones ringing because that's what would happen. And other programs have gone on from here, all kinds of things. So what are we going to do for the next 175 years? We have a continuing project to embrace our history and to feed the hungry. As I mentioned, our Sac Lunch program happens here every Saturday, and anytime the doors are open or anytime anybody's here who has a key, Sac Lunches. We've embraced our Hispanic heritage. The diocesan Hispanic ministry started largely here, which is why we have Mary over there. That's a gift from our Hispanic congregation. One of our rectors also started a Japanese Christian Episcopal church in Sacramento. The lectern is a gift from them. So we now do an ofrenda every Dios de los Muertos. We have a care closet in the parish hall filled with all kinds of good stuff that our good people give away on Saturdays. Tarps, sleeping bags, tents, toiletries, all kinds of things. And then we're looking forward. We have had installed just a couple of weeks ago 2 new murals, or a single mural that's in 2 panels. If you drive down J Street, look up, or walk down J Street. After the fire, when they installed this organ, there were 2 other small windows in what's now the organ chamber that they bricked up because there's organ pipes that go all the way up. So we now installed those colorful murals. The artist picked the colors from our stained glass, and then also was really impressed by things like our Saturday lunch program and the compassion we have for our neighbors. And so that inspired her to create that new mural. So while we recognize that none of us are perfect, and our institutions certainly aren't perfect, a lot has grown out of this building, and a lot continues. So I'm excited that we will continue for the next 175 years. And with that, I think I'm almost on time. Actually, I'm ahead of time, boy. Or that clock's wrong, one of the two. No, we're actually slightly ahead of schedule. But anyway, does anybody have any questions? Yes. We aren't very involved with the local Latino community. That is, we are working with the FaithX program, Small Church Vitality Improvement Program, and when we looked at the demographics, that's basically the demographic that's missing from our congregation. The rest of the racial profile of our area fits the congregation actually pretty well at this point. But I think possibly part of the reason is a lot of our Latino people here are working in the service industries. So I worked with the Latino ministry when I was helping out at St. Matt's. I actually can celebrate in Spanish. Don't tell anybody that. You didn't hear that, Mac. So anyway, yeah, that is. So that's one of the things we will be doing with the Small Church Vitality Improvement Program is coming up with a micro strategy that might help us do that. Any other questions? Good. Well, again, thank you. Yeah. No, we didn't find any evidence of the church itself being involved. We found evidence of the church being pro-slavery during the Civil War, the congregation. But as far as redevelopment, we did not see that. But, as I said, over our history, we did find many places where we had prominent members of the community who would be involved. You know, the mayor, city council members, state legislature. Hammond, Colonel Hammond was one of the early judges of California, and his wife was a musician, so he donated that. They have the most prominent crypt in the city cemetery, to give you an idea. So, yeah, while no records of the church directly being involved, we do have records of the members, and they were leaders of the community over many, many decades. Yes, Bishop.
I heard you talk about Japanese congregation.
Right. That's about all I know. The records talk about it happening, and that's about it, But we're still, we have what we call the attic, which is above the offices and the balcony, and there are boxes and boxes and boxes of material that we have been going through, and we keep finding little nuggets, like the piece of the prisoners actually creating the stone. That was what I had heard from folks for years was, well, the stone was the same stone as Old Folsom Prison. Great. And then it's like, oh yeah, and the rector hired the prisoners to cut the stone. Go rector. Yes. Yeah, so that's a good point, that the local, and that chapter, the Japanese Citizens League, might have more information on that as well. Because we are all, everybody who reads from the lectern is all, if they look at it, it's like, wow, this was donated by the Japanese community. Why? And it's like, oh, one of our rectors actually helped start the Japanese church here in town. Yeah. Right. No, the cheapest path was through the Japanese community, because they they literally were designed to break up. I mean, that was part of the community racism that happened all over places. How to again, through people like Sacramento Preservation and learning from the Japanese community. I've attended some events at the Buddhist temple where they've talked about what's happened to their community, and that was Japantown. But it wouldn't have been too hard to move the freeway over a few blocks so it didn't go right through the middle of the neighborhood, because it literally went through the middle of the neighborhood. Yeah. And also I heard about that from a dear friend who has gone to heaven at this point, who grew up in Sacramento, whose family home was taken by the other leg of the freeway, going up on 29th, between 29th and 30th. He lived to be 100 years old, and he remembered everything. Any other questions? Well, again, welcome here, and thank you so much. And with that, I think it's Tina's turn.
So, hello. So, as you heard and saw, I am Tina Campbell. At present, I serve the diocese as the Indigenous Missioner for the diocese. And I'm glad that Rick took the time to acknowledge the land on which we're meeting today. For those of you who might wonder, I am Mexican on my father's side and Navajo on my mother's. And as you could see from the earlier slide, my ties to St. Paul's are long and deep. Back in 1969, a friend of mine we were in teacher training together, and she was taking organ lessons, and she was going on an organ crawl, which is something organists do. They crawl around the inside of historic organs, literally crawl. So it's an organ crawl. So she came to an organ crawl here at St. Paul's. She was quite taken with the place, and she called me and asked me to go to church with her the next Sunday. And so she and I came to Eucharist here. At that time, she was a happy Presbyterian. I was Roman Catholic. I wasn't looking to leave the Roman Church. But I had come out of the heyday of the 60s on campus at UC Davis. I had been active in the Newman House. And I was looking for a church that was socially active in the community. And I got here, and there was a clothes closet, and there was a food closet, and there was the telephone reassurance program, which I immediately signed up to volunteer for. There was a food bank. They had teen dances. Brian, who later became my husband, and I used to chaperone them here. It was exactly the church we were looking for. That year we were received into the Episcopal Church, the two of us, and it really stuck because she is now an Episcopal priest, and of course I'm ordained a deacon here. Over time, we're into the 70s, the 80s, over time, the ministries evolved, and ECS was established, Episcopal Community Services, which is still going in the diocese. And as Rick told you, the food closet went on to be its own 501c3, and the telephone reassurance was taken over by Eschaton. And as Rick also mentioned, a number of ministries started here. A seminarian who was bilingual showed up and wanted to start what was called Hispanic ministry then. And so he invited me into that work, and so we started canvassing the neighborhood. We had a small Spanish-speaking congregation. After he was ordained and moved on to pastor a church, I continued. I had the names of 4 priests in the diocese who could at least read Spanish, and they would read the service, yes. Grant Carey was one of them. Bob out at St. Michael's was one of them. I can't remember his last name now, of blessed memory. Anyways, and I preached, and so that's kind of the way we moved along here. So, as you heard, the first real organized effort at Hispanic ministry started here. One of our associate priests, Jim Strawcamp, went off to a weekend training on working with AIDS patients, and he brought that learning back here. And we began the first AIDS ministry in the diocese. And then, as Rick so generously said, we could say the diaconate, the emergence of the diaconate as a free and equal order emerged here. After my ordination, 5 more deacons were ordained in the next year. It really pushed the door open. So I had been a part of this church for so many years and just marveled at how a small congregation, decimated by white flight, could continue working into programs that evolved into things much larger, like River City, and also continued at the local level here, as you heard Rick talk about sack lunches and still a food closet, still a clothes closet, and those sorts of things. The roots of St. Paul's are certainly complicated, as he said. In my work as Indigenous missioner, unlike many of my colleagues across the church, I don't minister in a native population. I don't minister in a native church. I live and work and minister in a church. I worship now, after being a longtime deacon at Trinity Cathedral, in a mostly white congregation and in a mostly white diocese, at least looking at our churches. So part of my work is that old 60s work of consciousness raising, just helping people become aware of the Native population in their midst, of the histories of our various churches. And I talk to priests and vestries and lay leaders about land acknowledgements. I'd say about 1/3 of our churches have land acknowledgements. And our diocese has recently adopted a land acknowledgement. I think we'll hear that at the revival. I believe so. I have been talking with Rick and he invited me to talk with his vestry about a land acknowledgement for St. Paul's. And we had a conversation about all of the incredible ministry that we celebrate here after 175 years, but also our history that is pretty much staring us right in the face with this window of Leland Stanford Jr., and knowing his history, his mixed history in the state. But land acknowledgements are something that are growing in interest. As Rick mentioned, in New Zealand, you hear them everywhere. My husband is Canadian, and we travel to Canada regularly, and you hear land acknowledgements virtually every event you go to. And a land acknowledgement is exactly that. It acknowledges the land. It acknowledges the people who once occupied the land upon which we all live or work or worship. People whose ancestors have been there for millennia. Land acknowledgements can be found on documents, on documents on websites, as our land acknowledgement is now on the website of the diocese. On programs, our Sunday program at Trinity has our land acknowledgement printed at the very beginning of the service. And they can be read out loud at lots of different public events, meetings such as this one, at performances, at worship services, even at sporting events. I've been to a hockey game that started with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement can be put together pretty easily, kind of on the cheap. There is that website that I believe was on the screen that you showed about the Native people, the Miwaks and the Nisenan and such. You put in your your zip code. Thank you. You put in your zip code, and up will pop the name of the tribes and peoples who were there. And you can just kind of slap that on your letterhead and call that a land acknowledgement. But that's really kind of an empty gesture. It sort of is a political correctness. And I think unless there's a willingness to engage Native folks, that it really just contributes to the dishonesty that Native people have already experienced. But when it's done carefully, and the people working on it are collaborating among themselves and with Native folks, if they can approach the work with an open heart and a willingness to learn some hard truths, to learn that familiar buildings and agencies and schools and sports venues sometimes bear the name of the perpetrators of the worst racism and violence, if they can do that, then this can be a vehicle for education, deep listening, and relationship building. It can open up avenues for repentance, part of which we'll do later today, and partnership with Native folk, particularly around issues of sovereignty and justice. Later on this year, I hope to lead a book study on a book by Joan Chittister called The Gift of Years. It's on aging, no surprise, eh? She goes through the different issues and phases that happen as we age. And every chapter ends with 2 observations. And all of the observations begin in the same ways. The first one begins, the burden of this issue, or these years, is da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The second observation, the next paragraph begins, the blessing of this issue, or these years, is da-da-da-da-da. So for me, right now, in this place, The burden of our history here is that at one time, greed and violence and racism had their way at the highest levels of government and the highest levels of our leadership. The blessing of this history is that the seeds of compassion and service and generosity were still there. Not so much directed to people who look like me and to people of color, but still, the seed's always there. Those seeds, I think, are what are blooming anew in our times now. Blooming and growing in awareness, in truth-telling, in welcoming, and in justice. It is the burden and the blessing of this history where we live in tension between these two when we embrace a land acknowledgement. We've all heard the saying about how the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. And I want to think that events like this today help us bend that arc just a little bit more. So thank you. And I guess since Rick set the example, I'm sure I have time for a few questions.
Yeah.
Anybody? Bob?
I was at a event at Sacramento area churches together a month ago.
Mm-hmm.
Where one of our parishioners in the diocese, Shirley Miles, was on her migrants here in Sacramento in the summer. And to start that, the ZACAC has a land acknowledgement.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the people from ZACAC got up and talked about that. He was a native person, told where he was from. He read the land acknowledgement. And the next speaker, a colleague of his, was a native person from the land we were at. He got up and explained that where he was from, what tribe he represented, and part of the honoring of that he was here on this place and to welcome them and to honor the visitors, he read a special land acknowledgement for visitors that his tribe had. And it was really rich to see that and connect their relationship. So what I learned that land acknowledgement is what you said about being aware of that pinch and so forth, but also when two peoples use them like that, it really builds a relationship. It's really, wonderful experience. Is that, did you experience that? Can you talk more about that?
It is for me, it is the reason to have a land acknowledgement. It's not just acknowledging the past, but it's also a step into the future where, the land acknowledgement we put together at Trinity, the last paragraph states that we commit ourselves to building and nurturing ongoing relationships. And so, because we have to put some muscle behind that. They can't just be empty words. Anyone? Yes. Of course. Mm-hmm. But because we've changed the relationship, and equals are now collaborating and working together. Yes. Yeah. And yes. Cameron.
One of the things that kind of stumps me a lot is in the different grounds we talk about the need for white people to do the work and not just rely on Native Americans or people of color
To do that, yes.
And so how do you engage Native Americans today without it feeling like we're putting the burden on them?
there's still very much the feeling that the burden remains on us. But I would say that that is, again, the moral arc. I see that as slowly bending to more collegial discussions. Okay? I really do see signs of hope. And just to digress a bit, in the Sacramento area, last year, our school district renamed 3 schools, one of which was Kit Carson. I've always hated the name of that school. Kit Carson did abominable things to the Navajo and to indigenous people generally. I was so glad when they changed the name. They changed John Sutter's name. John Sutter's middle school is now Miwok School. And they've gone from being the Miners to being the Oaks. Just recently, if you read the local news, the Miwok people have been able to purchase that big hole right downtown Sacramento that was going to be, a 23-story fancy condo, that went bust, and then the CalPERS, the State Retirement Fund, tried to make something with it. Now, the natives have it. And people are worried that land acknowledgements somehow open the door for a reverse land grab. No, I mean, that has been the reason that some land acknowledgements have been argued over. But it's not that. Native people are anxious to tend the land again, to have a place in the community, to share our culture. It's not about wanting to own all the downtown property. And I really think if there was a real fear of that, you wouldn't see land acknowledgements being created in so many places, because everybody would be fearful for their real estate. But what it brings is just a more equitable relationship that can grow. And isn't there, I don't know when it is, Bishop, Mark DeBelka talking about up in farther up in the northern part of the diocese, the rancheria there is putting on a disaster resilience program that everybody else is invited to, because now we understand that Native people did know something about the land and how to live on it and how to live in a sustaining way, how to deal with fire. Son of a gun. People who lived here millennia learned something. Anyways, so I am hopeful, and I think, Karen, that eventually the conversation will be, it won't always have to be me doing the talking. Other people will stand up and do the talking. All right, anything else?
I just want to tell a quick story along those lines. I worked for 27 years for the state government, and I was the manager of water quality standards when I retired. One of the my proudest moment, I have to say, is working with the tribes. We developed beneficial use definitions for tribal uses of water. We developed a cultural beneficial use for them. And it took much longer than I ever thought it would, because I came and presented this at a tribal council meeting and said all the wrong words. All the wrong words. I spent the next 5 years listening and building those relationships, and got to the point where the tribal governments trusted me enough that when we had meetings, I'd get a call from their environmental people and say, Rick, do we need to be there? It's like, well, it's a technical meeting. Send your environmental director. Or it's a hearing before my board. If you can, a tribal elder or two would be good. And I'd help fill up the building. The best one was they just could not understand why we needed a cultural beneficial use of water for the tribe, tribal cultural beneficial use. Why wouldn't recreational standards cover it? One of the elders got up at a hearing, and one of my board members who was waffling, who was a member of the Diocese of San Joaquin, she just could not figure this out. Why did we need this? And a tribal elder got up and said, you know, let me tell you how we use water. We have our World Renewal Days, which include an initiation into womanhood that requires full immersion. We do that at a specific time, a specific place. It would be like you being baptized and could only be baptized in the River Jordan. She got it. She got it. And so I've done no consulting work after I retired, except for the tribes when they call me.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Rick. All right, anything else? Right. Is there a question way back there? Let me get a little closer here. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear everything. Well, I think since I'm working in a church-based setting right now, I would think that if we actually lived out the vows that we say when we renew our baptismal vows, if we really took to heart to respect the dignity of every single person, right, to tell the good news, that the world would right itself. And yes.
Yeah.
And that's what we're, yeah. I'm sure you could ask lots of people and get their story of mistreatment. Yeah. And you're welcome. And I'm inviting all of you to be part of the solution too.
Right.
Thank you. Bless you.
Just was asking about why we're here in the mission and what we'd like to see out of it for our communities, basically. Yeah, so that's her concern and question. Yeah.
Oh, sure, of course.
Thank you. So just to extrapolate a little bit about that disaster resilience that's coming up in May, it's really quite a lovely partnership that has been building over time. I know that in Eureka, in fact, there was an unusual move to return some land to the native people there. I also know that our disaster resilience missioner, Mark DeBelka, has been working with the tribes up in the far northwest around issues of disaster resilience. Frankly, when the rest of the grid goes down, I'm pretty sure their grid stays up because of the work that they have done. But that's not all of it. What I love is that this is going to be taught by the folks who know it best, the tribal folks, but it's being hosted by the Episcopal Church in town, so it is accessible to folks who are in that area. The fact that that was agreed to is a huge deal. I like to think that it meant that we listened enough to make a beginning, and that beginning is represented in this partnership, where it is happening, and I love that our missioner for disaster resilience has been part of it. They are such small steps, but they're new steps, and I'm grateful, and I'm really grateful for the many people who have stepped out to make that happen.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you. And with that, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is always a miracle. Um, we do have a break at this point, and William Berg, president of Sacramento Preservation, who's doing our next talk, is here, and he has some of his books. So I invite you. We had a 15-minute break, but since we're ahead of schedule, let's do like 25. And there's lots of strong coffee, as the congregation here can tell you. When the priest makes the coffee, it's strong. So coffee and goodies and books. kept looking for the, okay, I think it's time to regather. Let me grab my coffee cup so as my congregation knows, you pry this out of my hand just before the service starts. Again, thank you all for joining us, and it's a great pleasure of mine to introduce William Berg, to President of Preservation Sacramento, one of his hats anyway, to talk about the West End. Bill does a great job with it, and I think you will enjoy hearing, again, as we started out with this program, that history is complicated, and that there are good things and not so good things about history, and that some things are born from the ashes. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Bill.
All right. Thank you. One of the things about what the previous speaker was discussing, and the importance of why is a land acknowledgement matter, is it's a recognition of what has been here, and the idea that we're not the owners of the land, we're stewards of it. We are here temporarily. There are people here there were people here before us. There will be people who are here after us, and we are carrying the remnants of the past, the history of the past, to pass along, as well as the land itself. And while there's now a land acknowledgement for the indigenous people before Europeans arrived, there are other stories, because every city is multi-layered. And the layers of this city that I tried to tell in several of my books, actually pretty much all of them, was the story of the neighborhood where this church was founded, that no longer exists. Today, you might recognize it if you go to the state capitol, and you'll note that between the Sutter Club and the Sacramento River, there's really nothing older than about 1950. Did we just not getting around to build things on that neighborhood until then? Of course not. There was already a neighborhood. And in fact, it was the first area of settlement in the city along the Sacramento River, that growth expanded to the east. Our streets were raised to keep us above flood levels. And who lived there? At the time, some of the wealthiest people in the city. Three of the big four, of which there were five at the time. Leland Stanford in his house here on N Street in its original form. Edwin Bryant Crocker with his house and later the museum where he stored his art collection. And Mark Hopkins in a more modest apartment that I don't have a photo of. He was a bachelor, and so he didn't need a full house. But they all lived in this neighborhood. And over time, the people who lived in the neighborhood changed. As Sacramento's waterfront grew more and more industrial, more and more filled with coal smoke and noise, and as we built farther and farther east, the people who got really rich in Sacramento didn't stay in Sacramento. They moved to San Francisco or to New York. All the three gentlemen that I just showed, they all moved to San Francisco, except, of course, Evan Bryant Crocker, who died before he had a chance to move to San Francisco, which is why we still have his art collection. And then the people who came in were the rest of the world. Generations and generations of immigrants and migrants who came to Sacramento to find work. There was an African-American community that had been there since the gold rush. There was a Chinese community that had been there since the gold rush. And during the later portions of the 19th century, when Japan opened up, Northern California was the first place that had Japanese settlement. People are familiar with the Wakamatsu Tea and Silk colony. That was the first Japanese settlement, but Sacramento's Japantown was one of the first Japantowns in the United States, settled in the 1890s originally. And it became we weren't the largest Japantown, but in terms of proportion, Sacramento was probably the most Japanese city in the United States. In addition, there was a Filipino community, And people from the Philippines had a special status because the Philippines were, of course, had been acquired by the United States during the Spanish-American War. But only men were allowed to immigrate. Women weren't allowed to. The assumption was that, because of by the end of the 19th century, there were laws against Chinese immigration, and there was rapidly coming immigration limits from Japan, what was called the Gentleman's Agreement, because whites in the United States did not want large Asian settlements. And how do you stop that? Well, if they don't have a wife, then you can't reproduce. So the assumption is that only men were allowed to come from the Philippines until actually the middle of the 20th century. And there was also a Latino community. Of course, California used to be Mexico, but a lot of the Latino community came up in the early 20th century during the Mexican Civil War and during various displacements of people from Mexico in the early 20th century, which established a barrio along L Street. What was the function of this neighborhood? I mentioned the smoke and the industry and the noise of this neighborhood because this was an industrial hub. People are familiar with Southern Pacific Shops because it's about the only industrial property that's still left in the city. But there were a multitude of railroads, mills, and factories, and heavy-duty work being done, including canneries. Some of the largest canneries in the United States for tomatoes were located in Sacramento, and they needed enormous workforces. The canning industry in particular used a lot of women in their workforce, and they were generally women of color. Other functions were that there was a labor market. About a quarter of all of the hiring for agricultural workers in California was done in a handful of blocks, roughly around where old Sacramento is today. You would live in a hotel in the neighborhood. You go to these huge hiring halls to get hired out to go, oh, you're going to go down to Stockton or up north to Redding to work on a farm for a few weeks, get paid, and come back. And Sacramento was your home base. And while you were there, while you were back in Sacramento, you had a hotel to live in. There's entertainment in the forms of, according to one report, 167 bars and taverns, and also burlesque halls. Another use of this area, generally involving people's bodies and their labor, during the late 19th and early 20th century was legal tolerated sex work. There were dozens of brothels and cribs and parlor houses in this neighborhood. I mentioned Japantown. It was the second Buddhist church on the West Coast, located in Japantown on O Street. And then originally, the first building that was specifically a Japanese-oriented business was a Nagasaki-Ken boarding house. And in many ways, the entrance to Sacramento looked like Japan, like this. As the city got larger and larger and more concentrated, the city continued growing eastward, with what's now Midtown Sacramento becoming the middle-class homes district, which even had its own railroad between 19th and 20th. And its first suburbs. These are the original city limits. Y Street, now Broadway, 31st Street, now Alhambra Boulevard, and then Highland Park and Oak Park, which were our first suburban neighborhoods reached by streetcars. And at the time, all you needed was the money to buy. So some of the first settlers of Oak Park were people of color, including George Dunlap, who worked at Southern Pacific in its dining cars, who bought a house there and built it himself. Reverend T. Allen Harvey, who founded Sacramento's NAACP branch, and the family of Ernesto Galarza, who, I mentioned those families who came up from Mexico during the Civil War. His family did as well. And he was fascinated by the West End and wrote about it compellingly in a book called Barrio Boy, which I highly recommend to anyone. And his family later purchased a home in Oak Park. At the time, there wasn't a limitation on doing so. One innovation that was happening in real estate in the early 20th century were called covenants, codes, and restrictions. And the first neighborhood with covenants, codes, and restrictions in Sacramento was Boulevard Park, which was the redeveloped site of the earlier racetrack for the California State Fair. Boulevard Park did not have racial covenants, but just a couple years later, 1906, realtors throughout the state of California began adopting racial covenants, which said that effectively you can't sell this property to anybody who isn't white. And just about every neighborhood
with a few exceptions, between roughly 1910 and really the mid-1960s had these covenants. And it meant that if you were a person of color, there were only certain places in the city that you could live. And initially the West End was that place, which over time was becoming more and more built up. You can see here there's the Tower Bridge, so this is no earlier than 1936, but dense industrial development along the waterfront, densely populated neighborhoods to the east of it. The first displacements during this era was during the Second World War. By this time, there was an active anti-Japanese movement in California, whose efforts was either to limit the size of the growth of the Japanese American community or, ideally in their mind, to remove them entirely. And they were ecstatic when Executive Order 9066, displacing and imprisoning our Japanese American population, was launched, and this resulted in the loss of a lot of property, land, buildings belonging to Sacramento's Japanese American community. This ended up being a benefit because these areas were available to people of color, you could buy them. And Sacramento's African American population tripled during and after the Second World War because there was a great migration taking place. African Americans were less likely to be drafted into the military, there were a lot of jobs to be filled, and there were places to work. And so the great migrations happened all over the country, from the south into the industrial cities of the west and the north, and Sacramento was one of them. And one of the institutions that's gone was this place called the Zanzibar nightclub, which had previously been a Japanese-owned business and was purchased by an African-American couple who were already here in Sacramento, Isaac Anderson, and a fellow named Nitz Jackson, who worked for the USO in the Navy and had a lot of connections with nightlife. He also connected with Sacramento's Army Air Corps base, McClellan. There were McClellan and Mather, two different air bases. Mather was the white base, and McClellan was the black base. They had a large African-American workforce, and their home, away from home, was the Zanzibar. It became an institution that people still talk about today as far as a lost legacy. They drew jazz acts from around the country, and previous efforts to integrate nightclubs in Sacramento had not worked because of overwhelming levels of racism. But we just got done fighting a war against racism in Europe, and we weren't supposed to do that anymore. So the Zanzibar trampled racial lines under dancing feet and became the city's first interracial nightclub, which of course spurred other folks in power to shut it down because apparently sex workers would sometimes come into the bar and solicit clients, which they did at every other bar in town. But it became an excuse to shut down the Zanzibar. Another property that did this sort of transition was the previous home of the Sacramento Valley Railroad's vice president on M and 5th Street, which was, before World War II, a Japanese-owned boarding house. And after World War II, it was purchased by a woman named Benny Twigg, who opened multiple businesses here. She was a beautician, so she opened a beauty parlor. She also opened a record store. It's one of the first places that sold what were called race records at the time, later called rock and roll. And she also noted that if you were black in Sacramento, you couldn't get a taxi. So she started her own Twigg's Taxi Company. A serial entrepreneur making new use of this old building. These neighborhoods, this part of the neighborhood was documented in a magazine called California, which in the early 1950s was intended as an African-American parallel to Sunset magazine, talking about black communities throughout California and profiling a different city, in this case Sacramento, talking about who the big players were, who were the business people and the churches, the civil rights leaders, the real estate leaders, who were very often trying to break a lot of the stereotypes and a lot of the boundaries that had set up preventing people from moving into new suburbs. There were even realtors living in Sacramento, J.R. Smith, who were building small, new suburban developments that did not have racial covenants because they were intended specifically for the African-American customer. Another thing that was happening in real estate during this era was what was called blockbusting. Like I said, there were racial covenants in most neighborhoods, so you couldn't move most places. But if you were a white realtor, and wanted to create a new market for this growing black customer. Because their options for housing were limited, they would pay more, generally 20% more. The general consensus was that a black neighborhood was worth less, that it would assess at a lower value. But because they would pay more for it, property values actually went up in neighborhoods of color. And how do you make a new neighborhood of color? Well, you pay a young black woman to push a baby carriage around a white neighborhood. And neighbors see this out the window. Time to sell at fire sale prices, below market value, to a realtor who turns around and sells it at the higher market value. This was a business model. And then there were plenty of people who were not happy with it. Like the attorney Nathaniel Colley, who he married a Sacramento woman, came to Sacramento after the war, and said, this isn't right. This business model takes advantage of people of color, and it breaks fundamental laws of the United States, which we assumed were covered. But racial covenants were not done away with by laws that prevented racism in housing, because they were considered to be private contracts. So people, were for the most part, still trapped in the West End. The Latino community also developing at the same time. This is the first home of Our Lady of Guadalupe at 3rd and O Street. It's the kitty corner from the Crocker Art Museum, and the rumor was it was the stables for the Crockers, but I don't think it was. But it was a pretty dramatic building, and it had previously been a Japanese movie theater and a Croatian church. The Latino community also on the rise, coming back after World War II, trying to establish themselves in their community, like all these other communities. As we're Americans. We're part of America, and our values are American values. And this is all of these communities portrayed themselves. So we're ready for the future. We're part of this country. Our children and sometimes our grandchildren are here, and so. We assumed that we're just going to be part of the American dream. Instead, the neighborhoods where they lived were called blighted. Blight is an imaginary disease of buildings caused by the occupancy of people of color, and generally the only cure is the bulldozer. That dates back to a practice that was established in the 1930s called redlining. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was created as a way to finance home loans, which previously you had to put up half the cost of the house and then pay it off over the corner of 10 years. Homeowners Loan Corporation's Federal Housing Administration housing innovation of the 30s was, okay, let's do a new type of loan where you pay 5% and you pay it back over 30 years. But not all neighborhoods are created equal, was the assumption. And the federal government said, well, who are experts on buying and selling housing? Realtors. So they hired realtors to create the policies for this plan, and part of what they did is, how do you assess risk for a neighborhood? The ways that realtors already were using was, well, who's living there? And the assumption was that people of color reduce the potential value of the land. So, and if you were in a neighborhood of color, you would get this red designation. Yellow is a neighborhood that was an ethnic white neighborhood, or there's what they called small amount of intrusion of people of color. And it was harder, but not impossible to get a home loan. If your neighborhood was blue, it meant there was a white neighborhood or a neighborhood that had racial covenants that was also white. And green meant there was a white neighborhood, lily white neighborhood with racial covenants. And the lands downtown, that meant that the core of downtown Sacramento had very little value economically in the view of banks. But how do you remove people from the land? And I'm going to show you a few pictures of these neighborhoods, but this is the way that this neighborhood has traditionally been portrayed in Sacramento. Is a urban wasteland filled with derelicts. And often the way it was portrayed was even more directly racist. Do you see the term blight? Do you see the color of the monstrous figure with gripping onto downtown Sacramento? And this was as part of an effort to get the people of Sacramento to approve a bond to purchase downtown, which failed, but it didn't stop redevelopment. Redevelopment, especially in cities like Sacramento, this was a national thing. Starting in the 1890s, the Chicago Columbian Exposition changed the way we think about cities. It had what was called the White City. It was built of shining plaster staff. It was just plaster, and it dissolved in a few months, but it looked like marble. And the counterpoint to the White City of the Chicago Columbian Exposition was the Midway, which is a multicultural, multiracial place of exhibits, with the assumption that these communities of people around the world were kind of going away, but we're going to document them first. And it became the dream of every city to have a white city in their downtown, this shining, gleaming city with there's the first Ferris wheel ever in the Midway, but behind the entrance to the city, not in front of it. And Sacramento was having a bit of a personality crisis in the early 1900s because the city of Berkeley tried to take away the state capital. So we said, in the wake of that, how do we market Sacramento, make it a place that people want to know is a great city? So they hired folks like John Nolan to design a new downtown with these grand boulevards and 45-degree angle crossings to allow views of the Capitol, with very little focus on what was going to happen to the people who lived in these neighborhoods. Also, during the Great Depression, there were a lot of redevelopment plans for how to improve cities, and this was one of the plans that was drawn up. You can see again, here's the Tower Bridge, here's the state capitol, was to create an enormous park. But there wasn't enough money for that. That cost a lot, and there wasn't a way to fund it. And again, not really much thought to what was going to happen to the people who were displaced by this, until after the Second World War, where cities that had been ravaged for decades by the Great Depression. It's really hard to keep your cities maintained when the entire country is in an economic depression. And then held back by material shortages during the Second World War, where you can't build because all the lumber and steel and everything is all going into the war industry. But it's the end of the war, and we're the victors. And so all of a sudden, there is money to do what's called redevelopment. And the assumption was, at first, that we would redevelop neighborhoods for the people who lived there. Horrendously unpopular, nobody wanted to do it. And so the 1947-1948 Redevelopment Acts produced almost no redevelopment, until 1954, when a new businessman's version of redevelopment was passed, which said that you don't need to keep the people there. You make a plan to move them somewhere else, and then you can sell this land to business people who will put it to the highest and best use, which at the time was largely concentrations of office towers. And this was a mid-1950s Richard Neutra plan, converting downtown Sacramento into something not too different, especially on Capitol Mall, but what you see today, but even more extensive. And here on 4th Street, between I and J, there was to be a small tribute of a passageway, an alley that would slope down to the original Sacramento street level and back up. And at the bottom, there would be a Japanese restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, and a Mexican restaurant. And these three restaurants were the recognition for the people, the tens of thousands of people that would be displaced. This was their equivalent of a little token of, hey, thanks for holding on to the land for us for the past 2/3 of a century. It was also using what was called Euclidean zoning, where the idea is that there's one purpose for each neighborhood. Most traditional American cities, it's just about any place that was built before World War II, very often you would work and live and recreate in the same neighborhood. There would be businesses downstairs and residences upstairs. The workplace would be either downstairs and you'd live upstairs, or within walking distance. So like the waterfront employment centers were within walking distance of the people who worked there, who lived in these neighborhoods. There were also streetcars, but generally streetcars were middle-class transportation. Streetcars cost 5 cents. If you're a worker who's barely making it, 5 cents could be save you some sore feet, or it could be a loaf of bread. So you choose the loaf of bread. And a lot of these hard choices were erased by Euclidean zoning, which said, okay, people will live here in auto-centric suburbs, they will work downtown, and they will shop in a third place, these new shopping centers in the suburbs. And never, ever are you supposed to mix them. That's an incompatible use. So in addition to all the other crimes of which the West End was accused, having incompatible uses was considered one of the worst. In the early 1960s, in the wake of all this, the Rumford Fair Housing Act was passed, which was essentially Senator Byron Rumford, one of the first African-American legislators in the state assembly, which said that, we're not going to allow racial covenants anymore. And it was passed by the legislature, but a year later, Proposition 14 was passed, which was sponsored by realtors that said, oh yes, we can enforce racial covenants. And so from 1964 to 1967, there was a court battle which also stopped the flow of redevelopment funds. And that didn't mean that we stopped redeveloping things, it just had to be done by the state. And so during this period, there was what was called the Capital Area Plan, funded by the state, which is when the area south of the capital, rather than just west of the capital, began its redevelopment and began its demolition with the idea of creating a state complex, one residence, a new governor's mansion, and a lot of offices and parking spots. And how did this get paid for? Redevelopment was funded through what we called tax increment financing, where you issue a bond instead of borrowing money that required voter approval, because the voters have to approve the city doing an expenditure. Instead, we're going to borrow money based on the future increased value of the land, which means you don't need the public's approval to do it. And so tax increment financing, leveraging the future property value against the current property value, became the way that these happened. But we didn't get redevelopment money between 64 and 67 because the federal government considered California officially too racist because of our embrace of Proposition 14. And note that these changes were not intended to be limited to the West End. The plans for redevelopment of downtown Sacramento were supposed to go all the way to Alhambra Boulevard and all the way to Broadway, with the exception of a handful of architecturally significant buildings. Accessed, of course, by new high-speed freeways. And had some discussion before the presentation started about why were the freeways located where they were. It's partially logistics, because you have to get people downtown. Partially, they became, in effect, walls between neighborhoods, where you have a neighborhood of color on one side of the wall and a white neighborhood on the other side of the wall. In some cases, they were convenient ways to remove portions of the neighborhoods that had not been removed by redevelopment, in the case of Interstate 5. I'm going to talk a little bit more about showing some images of the West End, and a lot of these images we have because of a fellow named Harold Oye, who was a pharmacist in Japantown, and I think most of us are old enough to remember when you had film developed, you took it to the drugstore. Well, Harold had a drugstore, and he loved taking pictures, and he took thousands and thousands of them. Of his original drugstore, there's photos from the 1930s, which shows some just extraordinarily American scenes. And of course, they were already taking pictures of cats back then. It wasn't the internet that introduced that fad. Yes. Yeah, it said you had your Instagram family album. And then here you see not only these adorable kids in front of the pharmacy, but you also see some of the migrant workers on the street waiting to get picked up. And things become even more real in color. And it's color photos of the West End, which proved so difficult to find. But once they reveal a very different story than the images of this run-down, decrepit neighborhood. This was a neighborhood that was actually, in many ways, on the rise after the Second World War. The Japanese-American community returned, and in some cases got their property back, in some cases didn't. But they were there. The African-American community, which, as you saw from the article in California, was building up new cultural institutions, new social institutions. The churches that had been here since the gold rush were thriving. And a neighborhood that, not too different from the one we know now as Midtown, densely populated, mixed use with the ground floor retail and people living above, very modern. Cultural institutions, social institutions like what was called a Hanami line, a row of cherry trees. This is on 4th Street, that vacant block. And right in the middle, this is the Catalina Hotel, owned by a Mexican immigrant by the name of Catalina Harrow, naturalized American citizen, who with great pride would announce to everybody that came to her hotel that when Duke Ellington came to Sacramento to play, he could fill the grand ballroom at the Senator Hotel, but he couldn't get a room there, so he stayed in her hotel. Work and reinvestment in new buildings. This tile setter always reminds me of the story of a tile setter by the name of Bacon, who had gone to Nathaniel Colley, the civil rights attorney I mentioned earlier, and said, because he wasn't allowed to join the tile setters union. And he said, well, you know, we're going to fight a lawsuit to do this, but in the meantime, why don't you get a license so you can be a contractor? And he ended up winning the suit, but by that time, he had already established his own tile setting business. And so whenever I see a tile setter or see some tile downtown, I wonder, is that Bacon tile? New construction was taking place. New buildings. This building was located at 4th and O Street. It was built in 1951. Within 5 years, it was declared blighted and had to be demolished. This was there's many communities of faith in this neighborhood. This is a Spanish language Episcopal. Oh no, I don't remember the congregation. I'm sorry. There's also the Buddhist church that we saw in the earlier photo in the Victorian building that burned in the 1920s, and this brick building at 4th and O Street was its replacement, along with a large auditorium, the Kaikon. And this actually became home for many of Sacramento's returning Japanese American community coming back from the camps, who would stay essentially as a short-term housing center while they were trying to find housing in what was now an extremely crowded neighborhood. This neighborhood, the Hotel Maine, built in the 1920s, Japanese American owned, with African American owned pharmacy, Taylor's Prescriptions at 6th and Capitol, right across from the Zanzibar Club, which I showed in an earlier slide. And the newer home of Oya's Pharmacy, at 3rd and L Street, again, that same block that we mentioned earlier, the one that was recently acquired by the Nissan. Some of the signs of Japantown survived redevelopment. People may recognize this sign for Wakano Ura Chop Suey, but not the building. The building was demolished in the late 1950s. It was along, there was 4th and N Street, but the sign was moved to the displaced Japantown along 10th Street. It's still hanging there today, and there are still a few Japanese American businesses in that community, even though Wakano Ura Chop Suey, which was a Japanese-owned restaurant, opened in the 1920s, but the owner said, well, Japanese food isn't popular with Americans, but Chinese food is, so I'm going to hire a Chinese cook. And they'll offer, oh, if you like this chow mein, maybe you'll like the sukiyaki too. So you introduced, innovated, using local ingredients to market, here's my community and I'm going to show it to you because it's amazing. But I'm going to bring you in with something I know you already like. The Yorozu Dry Goods Store was actually located just south of where the Target is on Broadway until the early 2000s when the last owner passed away. And the sign was actually retained. It was still out there on Riverside Boulevard, and it's currently in the holdings of the Center for Sacramento History. This is the Eagle Drugstore, which was started by a Japanese-American druggist, and he also established a hospital upstairs because he was not satisfied with the way that Japanese-Americans were treated at the county hospital. It ended up closing during the Depression, lack of money, but in the meantime, it served not only the Japanese-American community, but also the other communities of the West End. The level of housing intensity varied in this neighborhood. This looks more like downtown. This is L Street. You can actually see where the street raising is on the far right, and 4th Street. So you have these older, very intense buildings, and a lot of what were called residential hotels, SRO hotels. And in the 1960s, there were, when these photos were taken in 1954, there were about 5,000 SRO hotel rooms, and about 500 people living on the street. Fast forward half a century to the early 2000s, and there were 500 SRO hotel rooms and about 5,000 people living on the street. The loss of this housing, which was replaced with nothing, was based on the idea that it was better to have people sleeping on clean sidewalks than dirty rooms. And of course, the sidewalks didn't stay clean, and the people did not disappear. They don't. There's some buildings like this sixplex, that you're going to see all throughout Midtown and some of Sacramento's older neighborhoods. There's some in Curtis Park and even East Sacramento. It looks like a single-family home, but it's actually 6 apartments, but it's designed to look like one. It's what, any of you follow contemporary development, it's what's called missing middle housing. Missing middle housing is not missing in Sacramento's pre-World War II neighborhoods, and it wasn't missing in this neighborhood until it was demolished. In some cases, that housing was valuable enough to save. This apartment building was previously located at 6th and O Street, still exists. It was moved to V Street and 13th, adjacent to the William Land School in Southside Park. Because it was a brand new building, in some cases, a lot of those brand new buildings were demolished. This one, it was just considered, okay, it's good enough where we can move it and reuse it. And the demolition of these neighborhoods, you can see there were a lot of signs when the demolitions began of, hey, closing sale, forced to vacate, and some of them were a little more unneighborly in tone, but they wanted to make clear that, okay, we're moving and this is why. In some cases, new businesses popped up to serve a customer who ended up not staying. This is Felix Flowers. He's an African-American veteran who, after World War II, moved to Sacramento, worked at the state printing plant, but he was also a member of the Elks. And if you were an Elk and you were black, you could not go to the Elks building in downtown Sacramento. So he said, I'm going to start my own business. I want to be a restaurateur. So he opened up a restaurant, the Flower Garden, located at 4th and O Street. And it's going to be a Southern restaurant, and it's also going to have a meeting room for the Elks. But at the time, mid-1950s, demolition was starting and people were being displaced. They didn't have enough customers to stay open. So we ended up selling it to Sacramento's Japanese American Citizens League, who established, there was another organization, the VFW, Post 8985, which was Japanese American veterans, who similarly were not allowed to join the white VFW post. So we said, we're going to start our own, and we've got this building that, oh wow, it already has meeting rooms. It's actually one of the only, I think there are 2 buildings left in Japantown, both built in the 1950s. This is one of them. And today, this building is recognized as a City of Sacramento landmark and is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And the VFW post still meets there, and still a public meeting space today. There were efforts to fight redevelopment, or to change it in a way that essentially, why don't we regrow these neighborhoods? Why don't we regenerate it? We're rebuilding housing already. Just let us continue that. But the city ended up saying no. Clarence Azevedo, mayor of Sacramento, native of Southside Park, the neighborhood just south of the redevelopment area, resigned from the redevelopment commission because he was so furious with the response. And I want to point out that this was not something that the people in this neighborhood weren't just acted upon, they reacted. They were engaged and they made enormous efforts to try to either accommodate or fight what was going on. They ended up failing just because the time and money were against them. And so demolition began. In total, about 30,000 people were cleared out of the central city between roughly 1950 and 1970. But they didn't vanish. This is the labor market, Japantown, Shiloh Baptist Church, the African American church that I mentioned, Southside Park, and Alkali Flat to the north. And here's the redevelopment area, the Capitol Area Plan, Capitol Mall, K Street Mall. So these neighborhoods were erased. The people moved where, again, the limited number of places where they could. Redlining is still legal. Racial covenants are still legal. They can't just move to Citrus Heights or Fair Oaks or even to East Sacramento. So the Latino community, for the most part, moves to Alkali Flat and Southside Park. The Japanese neighborhood and Chinese neighborhood both move to Southside Park. And the African American neighborhood, because there was already an existing African American neighborhood in Oak Park, Shiloh Baptist Church led the way by buying property and rebuilding in Oak Park and bringing the community with them. Downtown got what it wanted. And here's the thing about it. Monetarily, redevelopment was extraordinarily successful. Property values went up 75-fold. Those redevelopment bonds paid off. So in a sense of dollars and cents, it was a success, while being an enormous human tragedy, and very much it was disastrous for the businesses and communities that had been there, that did, in many cases, restart somewhere else, but were held back by decades and cost millions of dollars to these communities. And so reducing home ownership, reducing economic security, reducing even just the idea of safety, the fact that your home is not your home. You can be displaced if you're inconvenient. And of course, the waterfront itself was a small portion of it, 6 blocks, was saved through direct intervention by the Kennedy administration to avoid certain parts of what had previously been the West End, had been the labor market, which we now know as Old Sacramento, which is a synthetic created name. Nobody called it Old Sacramento until about 1940, I think, when there was a movie called In Old Sacramento that came out. But these communities also found ways to encode their past on the landscape. One of the most successful was the Royal Chicano Air Force, which was an artist group started by there's a whole team of artists who arrived in Sacramento, were educators at Sacramento State, members of the community who started painting murals. And you can still see those murals today. There's the mural at Southside Park on the Callahan Bandstand next to the current location of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The Laserium mural underneath Interstate 5, which was supposed to be strictly non-representational, but there are many hidden messages. If you take a look at Laserium, you can see the factories of the West End. You can see trucks carrying people, carrying the workers, the braceros, to distant farms to work. You can see a guy that's either holding a rifle or a machine gun, depending on how you look at it. And the kind of old line about the guitar with this machine kills fascists is implied. And then the emergence, or the metamorphosis mural on the side of the parking structure at 4th Street between K and L. The Shiloh Baptist Church relocated from the West End to its current St. Andrew's AME, the oldest African-American church on the West Coast, relocated to Southside Park. And you can still see the stained glass windows of its previous church hanging in their windows today. I mentioned Shiloh Baptist Church, which relocated to Oak Park. They saw the writing on the wall and sold their property ahead of redevelopment. Its building, designed by Sacramento's first African-American architect and largely built through the efforts of its pastor at the time, who had been a construction worker prior to his calling to the cloth. It was also a Sacramento Register landmark and listed in the National Register. The Women's Civic Improvement Club, which was an African-American women's service organization, which started in part because there weren't safe places for single black women to live. They were prohibited from living in most of the city, except in the same part of the city, which, as I mentioned, was often a place. So if you were a single woman, you lived there, it was associated that you were involved in the sex work industry. So one of the things that they did is they established a couple of boarding houses. The first at 19th and T Street, a building's still there, and another one at this grand mansion, which ended up being in the path of Highway 50. But they're still around as a service organization. They moved to Oak Park. Same time in Sacramento's Chinese American community, there's a lot of consideration of what's going on. Is the northern edge of this area, what had been the Chinatown along I and J Street, wasn't quite redeveloped yet, but they knew it was coming. And a Sacramento student who was studying for his master's in architecture at UC Berkeley, Suki Lee, said, well, I've got this idea. Instead of, that path where you dip down to the original street level and there's 3 restaurants, how about if we make it a neighborhood instead? And we use this groovy modern design that he's studying at the Worcester School of Architecture to incorporate traditional Chinese architecture into a new Chinatown. And that's largely what we ended up doing, in part because a lot of those civil rights struggles of the 1960s catalyzed subsequent struggle. And the disasters that happened to Japantown and Latino Barrio and the African American community in the West End had encountered resistance because of a growing civil rights movement that said, that's not really okay. The other advantage that the Chinese community had was wealth. By the 1950s, a lot of Sacramento's supermarkets and wholesale grocery distributors were Chinese. So they had some money, they had their own money to catalyze redevelopment. And instead of being entirely excluded from the process and resulting in a neighborhood which did not reflect who they were, they said, instead we're going to do a redevelopment project that meets this community's needs. Most of these buildings were designed by Chinese American architects to meet needs like housing Instead of displacing the people from the neighborhood, we're going to build new housing for the people in the neighborhood to live. Instead of displacing the cultural institutions, we're going to create new buildings for those cultural institutions. And so even today, half a century later, this area, it's often ignored because there's these high-speed street freeways on either side, but Sacramento's Chinatown is a historic place in its own right. It's kind of under threat because it's been so unnoticed. But it features all the complements of a Chinatown. This is a Paifang Gate, the grand entrance. A temple, actually a Confucius temple, which predates the rest of the neighborhood, is built in the 1950s by 3 different Chinese-American architects, one of whom was a woman. There weren't many Chinese-American architects working in California in the 1950s. How many were women? And we have an example of her work right here. And then this is Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and there's a statue of him and a small museum because while he's in many ways was considered one of the architects of modern China, came to Sacramento to raise money for his revolution. And supposedly he wrote part of the Chinese Constitution while he was here in Sacramento. And also you have things like institutions like family associations and restaurants, which all express traditional Japanese architecture mixed with modern design. And that's maybe how you recognize or tell a different story with redevelopment versus erasure. Integrating what's already there, the building that was already standing since the 50s, into your 60s and 70s design. For the capital area plan, that state complex, that actually kind of went by the wayside when Reagan was governor. And because he said, well, instead of building these expensive state buildings, we're going to lease a bunch of properties out in the suburbs for state offices, but we'll keep demolishing the neighborhood because we need plenty of parking. And then when Jerry Brown took over, he said, well, let's try something different. And he hired this group of young grad students. Some of you may know some of the people in there. I don't know how many of you know Dennis Bilo or Jackie Whitelam, but they're still around, part of our community. They came as architecture students, again from Berkeley, to look at what else we could do with that area that had just been bulldozed, and maybe we could start rebuilding it into something like the neighborhood that we just got done demolishing, with mixed-use neighborhoods and passive solar and other ways to repair a neighborhood that had been traumatized. This is what happened there. This is the 1950 population, 58,000 people living in the central city. By 1970, the bottom was reached, 28,000. Then from 1970 to 1990, things actually got better, 32,000. One thing that happened largely because of downtown Sacramento's office boom of the 1980s and 90s is population dropped again to 30,000. The good news, and I need to update this, as of 2020, the population of Sacramento's central city is up, if you include the rail yards, nearly 40,000. This is a downtown on the rise, and we didn't have to demolish half the neighborhood to do it. In fact, the places, as you can see here, with the lowest population are the places where the high-rises are, because not many people live there. How else do you recognize what has been lost? This is a plaque located on the top side of the parking structure at the county Board of Supervisors building, recognizing the original location of St. Andrew's AME, which relocated to Southside Park. Well, you can do a plaque, but what do you do on Capitol Mall? Maybe we could use a plaque. What else would you do to tell the story? Well, there's that vacant lot which just got purchased. How could this place tell a story? You can do it really easily in the short term. Just take these walls that are meant to hide the hole, and you can take some of the photos I've shown you today, turn them as super graphics that tell the story of the neighborhood. Not only the story of the indigenous people who were here since time immemorial, but the people who were there since the coming of Europeans, who were the stewards of that land for generations. Tell more of those stories. Or, even more high-tech, an augmented reality program which allows you to hold up your phone and see into the past. The software is out there, it's just a matter of turning it into something. And so there are multiple ways, multiple paths, both low-tech and high-tech, to tell the story of these lost neighborhoods. But it begins with sharing them, with communication. And that's something that I am really happy to say. I've been doing this part since about 2006, since I published my first book. And what had been lost history is now part of our city's dialogue. As the city of Sacramento, if you look at our racial demographics, they'll look a lot more like the West End. We're a multi-ethnic, multiracial city. We are a city of diversity. And for a long time, that was a bad thing. City was a 4-letter word. But now we're a new place with an old legacy. These are some of my sources: Center for Sacramento History, the Sacramento Room, the archive.org, CSUS. A lot of what I've written in my books came from unpublished master's theses, and the Oye family collection. That's a lot of the color photos that I showed you. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for letting me be part of this. I think I went a little bit over time, but do we have a few minutes for questions?
Sure, go ahead.
Please.
Oh, the tavern.
The ground floor was a brewery. It was the old tavern. It was one of the first breweries in the city in the 1850s, and then it became a tavern through Prohibition. In the 1920s, when alcohol was illegal and people technically didn't drink, but actually they did, that the addition was done to the top. And so that's a later edition, which is now historic in its own right. It's been there for more than a century. And the news about that is that, I don't know if you know what's happening with that building, but it has been converted, if you're familiar with Ronald McDonald House, which is a places that are built near hospitals for people with limited means to be able to stay near their kids when their kids are being treated in the hospital. I'm afraid I don't recall the name of the program, but it's a similar program, so it'll be extended stays for people with limited means whose kids are being seen in the nearby hospital. So that's going to have a really important community use in that amazing historic building. One of the jokes I tend to tell is that it's the list of places that weren't either a speakeasy or a brothel in Sacramento is probably shorter than the list of places that weren't. So I'd never say no, but I don't know. It's spreading. Again, from the previous speaker, the arc of the universe, it bends that way because everybody gets out and pushes. And so, but we're starting to see change. We still have a long way to go, but that's how we get there, is through that journey, and it's a journey we're on now. I am 15th. I'm not personally familiar with it, but yes, there were a lot. And they were focused in the area of the West End, but they were all over the city. And many of them were displaced. Another one across from the Zanzibar, the Momo Club, moved to Oak Park. So many of them moved multiple times. What draws people to America? Because we've got room, and maybe because the rent is cheaper here than somewhere else. Because opportunity and space, and that's what has drawn people here. Is they felt like it's not easy to leave your home, but if you have to, you gotta go somewhere, and you go to the place where you can make your best stake. Sacramento and California and the United States have not always been the most welcoming to everybody who arrived. But this ended up being, if not the easiest path, at least the least difficult. Yeah. That's why people generally would move to a new neighborhood. Oak Park already had a black community, so if there's a nucleus of a neighborhood, if there's a displacement, that's where people tend to go first.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill, so much for this. I've heard you speak several times on this subject, and every time it's just amazing. So I really appreciate it. There we go. Perfect. Yeah, and his books are great. If you want to learn more, buy one of the books. So our next thing, make sure I'm doing this right. We'll have a talk, Miriam Casey and Bob Wilson will talk about becoming a beloved community. And I just wanted to, I was going to say a similar thing, Tina. One of the things that ends up drawing these communities is a core comes and frequently a community of faith will spring up. And the social services that happen draw more people. If you're coming from the Ukraine and there's a Ukrainian church that has social services available to it, you'll keep coming, right? So. Oops.
Away from a history lesson to where do we go from here? Does that sound okay? Yeah? I don't know how to put that on.
Don't know how to put that on.
No, I don't know how to put it on. Okay?
Yep.
Sounds like it's working.
That's one.
Great. And we're going to move from facts and figures to matters of the heart. Is that okay? Okay. So I'm Miriam Casey. I'm co-chair of the Commission for Intercultural Ministries, which is the social justice, racial justice focused commission in our diocese. And with me is my husband, Bob Wilson. He's the chair of our advocacy team because we do a lot of advocacy. And we're delighted to be here today. So, how many of you know what beloved community is? Okay, some of you have heard the term. That's about half of you haven't, though. So this is good. We're going to give you a little primer on beloved community in this next short period of time. And I want you to know that becoming beloved community is the Episcopal Church's long-term commitment to racial healing, reconciliation, and justice. So this isn't something that originated with our diocese or with our commission. It's from the national church. It's a commitment that they have made and that has been addressed throughout our church. It's based on the Bible's most important commandments. Does anybody know what those are? To love God and to love our neighbor. Thank you. As ourselves, yes, that's right. So that's what it's based on. It's based on love. Love for God and love for our neighbors. The path to racial healing, reconciliation, and justice is grounded in 4 interrelated commitments we make in our baptismal vows. So, have any of you been baptized? I'm guessing. These vows have been made over you, or you have made these vows yourselves. So these are things you've already promised to do. They're nothing new. They're things we've already promised to do. And the journey through these commitments, these 4 commitments that we make in baptism, have been fashioned, if you will, as a labyrinth. Now, some of you have the handout in front of you, which is great. You can see here there's a labyrinth. Do you see it there? At the top, okay. And so the labyrinth has 4 parts to it, 4 quadrants to it. And each quadrant is based on one of those baptismal promises. That's where it comes from. And what we know about labyrinths is it's not a straight line from here to there, is it? No, not at all. It's working our way through, working back again, going forward, working back again, as we're finding our way. And that's the way this journey is. It isn't a straight line. It's like a labyrinth. And so I would like to, in the next few minutes, talk with you about those promises that we've made and about the commitments that we make with those promises, and to help us to consider how we at St. Paul's in this community, in this diocese, can engage with those promises, those commitments. The first commitment, and if you have your piece of paper there, you'll see it there. It's the first one right there. Telling the truth. Telling the truth about the church and about our communities and about racism. This is about racism and how it is involved with our lives. So the promise, now back to the baptismal promise. The promise is to persevere in resisting evil, and whenever you fall into sin, repent and return to the Lord. That's the promise, folks, we've made. And so, it goes back to what's most important, loving God and loving our neighbor. Today, we've heard a lot about the history, haven't we? Yeah, we've really focused on the truth. And so we know a lot more now than we knew even a few hours ago about the history of this place and this community. In the diocese, there are 2 opportunities to learn about racism in our country and in our communities. One is a 1-day workshop that's offered by the Commission for Intercultural Ministries. It's called I Will with God's Help, Journey Toward Racial Healing and Justice. So that's one way that we can support you to learn more about how you can engage with God's love in the community. There's another course that's offered. It's called Sacred Ground. And I know some of you have taken that because I talked with you earlier today. And again, that's another way to learn about our communities and how we can be active as healers in our communities. One thing you may not be aware of is last year, the diocese embarked on a racial justice audit. Have any of you heard of that? Yes, some of you have. Okay, good, good. And it's all about understanding racism and how it impacts us as a community of faith. Yeah. And the first year, which was last year, we focused on the diocese and the leadership, which involves a lot of committees and commissions, my own as an example, and understanding how racism is in play even there. This year, in 2024, the focus is shifting to our congregations. So my congregation, Church of the Incarnation in Santa Rosa, your church, St. Paul's, Sacramento, all the other congregations have an opportunity to participate in this audit to understand, again, how racism is impacting our lives as communities of faith and in our involvement with our local communities. So we've got that coming up for our congregations this year. So we're learning, we're really trying hard to understand the truth. We're really trying hard to understand the truth. But not just to understand the truth. That's not enough. It's not enough. What we need to do beyond that is to understand how we, as people of faith, as followers of Jesus, am I right about that? Are we followers of Jesus? Yeah. Well, what was Jesus all about? Love. He was about love, right? Okay. All right. That's the word. That's the key word. And so we need to know the truth, but we need to do it so that we can move beyond the way things currently are. That takes me to the second commitment, which is to proclaim the dream of the beloved community. And so, there, it's that column there. So, what's the promise? What's the promise that we make there? It's to proclaim by word and example the good news of God in Christ. What would God's community be like? Really, think about it. What would it be like? What would it be like? That's the dream. That's the dream that we're reaching for. And it invites us to consider what our communities and churches would be like if they were the beloved community. And again, when we think about beloved community, what do we think about? We think about loving each other, caring for each other, wanting the best for each other, even making changes within ourselves if we need to in service to the other, to care for them. And so that's what this is about. What would that dream look like? And we've mentioned some things here for St. Paul's. You've mentioned some things today that are reaching in that direction, like land acknowledgement. That's a big deal. Another thing you've talked about is growing your relationship with the local indigenous community and the Latino community. Those are all really good examples of reaching toward that dream of a right relationship and the common good. The third commitment is to practice the way of love. And it's based on the baptismal promise to seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving our neighbors as ourselves. So there it is. There it is. We need to grow our capacity to be more loving and to love our neighbors as ourselves. So this invites us to really work on that and in order to be healers in our communities and churches. It calls us to develop relationships across dividing walls and to seek Christ in the other. Things like what we're doing today, this pilgrimage, is a great example of a way to grow in our capacity to love. Again, these two courses I mentioned earlier, Sacred Ground and I Will with God's Help, Journey Toward Racial Healing and Justice. These are good ways to grow, to understand, and really, it's internal work, right? It's like, how do I need to maybe reprogram myself a little bit to be able to reach out in a different way to the community that I live in? The fourth commitment is to repair the breach in society and institutions. And this is a big one. This is a tough one. It's based on the baptismal promise to strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. As we journey toward the beloved community, we'll identify institutions and systems in our communities that are broken. Haven't we heard about examples of that today? Yes, we have. And they're there. They're next door. They're down the block. They're around the corner. We read about them in the Sacramento Bee all the time. This baptismal promise calls us to engage in those areas and to bring God's healing love, that reconciling love, into those broken areas. It isn't enough just to know about it. We're called to do something about it and to engage in those particular areas. Bob, would you please elaborate about how we can participate in the repair of breach in society and institutions?
Thank you, Miriam. I'm Bob Wilson. I'm active in several CIM ministries, and I'm very grateful to be married to Miriam Casey. And so we've just been on quite a journey this morning, right? This in Sacred Ground that Miriam mentioned, this is a 10, now 11-week course that you get together with a circle and you read ahead of time, watch films, and then you travel this labyrinth over 10 or 11 weeks. Okay, we've just gone from truth to proclaiming the dream to learning the way of love to repairing the breach in about 3 hours. So, you know, that's pretty quick. So I think a lot of this, if this is your first time, is still up here. The good news about the lengthening of Sacred Ground is it goes from here to here, because this is hard work. You know, we can go away from here and be overwhelmed about the history and what has happened and the things that have destroyed communities and destroyed lives and so forth, or we can start to process it and, you know, really think about, geez, it shouldn't be that way, okay? I want to do something, but I got to learn how to do things first. I can't just jump to fixing things like we really like to do, right? But finally, we can get to this part of repairing the breach. And I like the nomenclature there, repair the breach. You know, you think of a leak in a dike that we might have around here in California, how, if, you know, that's happened recently where things have gotten destroyed and whole communities have been flooded, how important that is to repair the breach. So I think we can really understand that. And striving is a long-term thing. We're not going to just go and put our finger in the dike and have it stop right now. It's a long-term effort that once we get into it, it's long-term, and it takes making relationships, which Reverend Tina talked about today, and Reverend Rick talked about today, that it's long, intense work to even get to the table to be able to have these conversations. But hopefully today, we all commit to starting, okay, of doing that, and going to start to make those relationships, to bridge those gaps, and starting to really build this beloved community right here, starting at St. Paul's and going out into the neighborhood and going out to other places in Sacramento and out through our diocese and eventually to the whole country and the world. So how do we do that? We learned a lot about institutions that are broken today, and we learned some of the things that happened and how horrible it was and how people got displaced and lives got ruined. And what is the effect of that today? I mean, it just didn't happen. There's still a lot of negative effects around that today. You know, you see, you know, parts of the city, neighborhoods and stuff that, you know, aren't really doing well. A lot of that has to do with this trauma that was inflicted upon groups of peoples, which we learned about, mainly peoples of color over the past 100 and some years, that has caused a lot of trauma as people were forced to leave places and so forth. So that trauma didn't go away just because the neighborhoods are being rebuilt or some businesses have stayed there. That trauma stays with you. And it is something that we've now learned more about the science of that. It does go to generations, and it does cause conflicts in families. It does cause things to not go right. And, you know, to realize that is, that maybe is something we need to work on. We need to work on how do you deal with trauma? How do you help people with trauma? And then that gets into our healthcare system. How do you ensure that neighborhoods of people who have been affected by these traumas over the past years have good health care, not just physical health care, but mental health care? And you start to look at all these systems and institutions that need to be fixed. The public safety criminal justice system, the housing system, the job system, the education system, and health care. You know, why are people of color disproportionately affected by not served well with those institutions and systems? Well, you get back to the history of it, a lot of it has to do with the history of these things that happened over the past 150 years, and the trauma that stays with people, and the lack of ability to grow like this in an even course like people who weren't affected by that trauma. Miriam and I live in a neighborhood in Santa Rosa that is an adult community, 55 plus. And as we were more getting into this, we looked around and say, why are our neighbors 99% white? Why are there not people of color in this neighborhood? And as we learn more about it, it's because, well, realtors in Santa Rosa didn't take people there in the 60s of color. They just took them to the southwest portion of town, which now is predominantly people of color. But our neighborhood, they didn't really get shown that. There maybe weren't any of these official covenants, but they weren't shown that. So there's reasons why things exist today that as we move from understanding the truth, we're claiming the truth. Well, it shouldn't be that way. Why aren't we a multicultural neighborhood? Why don't we have people that look like all the peoples of the world here in our community? Well, there's a reason for that. So once you start to dig in this more, it's like, boy, there's a lot of breaches to repair. So where do I start? How do I strive for justice and peace? As I said, remember I said striving is a long-term thing. Like, how do I strive to be fitter? How do I strive to eat better? How do we strive for justice and peace among all people, and respect the dignity of every human being, and look at everybody as a child of God? How do we do that? That's not an easy thing. So how do we start? So let me tell you my story, how I really got more intensely involved in this work of racial reconciliation and healing. And it started 4 years ago when the diocese, Karen and Miriam and Joanne and Lynn Zender and Kathy Hopner just started creating the Sacred Ground courses in our diocese, which really started like in 2017 in the National Church. 2020 we started in here in Northern California. I was in one of the first circles. Your gatherings are called a circle. And you learn about the history of racism in our church, in our country, and from the standpoint of indigenous people, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian American Pacific Islanders. And you learn this history, you learn the truth. And as we were going through that, George Floyd was murdered during our class. So we were learning all these things about the truth, and then there it was, gone viral on video, George Floyd being murdered on the street. That took it from a head thing to us to a heart thing really quickly. The lessons became real. We're like, oh my gosh, this truth that we've been learning about the lynchings that took place all over California of every group, indigenous, African American, Asian American Islanders, Pacific Islanders, and Latino, took place all over California. They're still happening on the streets in Minneapolis. Oh my gosh. So that we really got the truth in our hearts. So a couple weeks later, Black Lives Matter rally started in our neighborhood, the busiest intersection. So I got my courage up, got out of my comfort zone, made my sign, and I went and stood there every week with my neighbors. It was busy traffic. And the interesting thing I learned about that was how people where your neighbors can stop and yell at you and say, oh, so you're going to let them come and rob your house and steal your women? People that I thought were my nice neighbors stopped and said that to me. Also noticed that we were there during the morning come to work time. All the people that were coming into our white neighborhood to be our housekeepers and our gardeners or carpenters or electricians or plumbers were people of color. And I was like, wow, what's that all about? That was quite an observation. So I learned more about that. So I really, sort of came of age during that in this movement. After that, I became a Sacred Ground facilitator, and I've taught many Sacred Ground circles to people all over the country and helped them take this journey. I'm a faculty member with the one-day workshop that Miriam talked about, and I'm also chair of the advocacy team for the Commission for Intercultural Ministry. And advocacy affects all the ministries we talk about here. Repairing the breach can happen unless our elected officials understand that the actions and the policies they make affect our communities and affect disproportionately, most of the times, people of color in our community than people who are white people like the most of us. And it's important that we need to advocate and let people know from our faith background, our values, and how these laws negatively affect people of color, and we need to uplift them and not do that. So advocacy is so important to get involved in. So what can you do leaving here today? What really touched you? What do you feel your heart tugged of all the things you learned about, all the challenges that face Sacramento, neighborhoods, St. Paul's? What really tugs your heart? That's the thing to look into more. I'm really passionate about this phase of this, this phase of this, this phase of this. So what can you do? How do I do these things? How do I become part of the healers? Well, what's a real need? Well, you heard some of them here today. You've talked to Reverend Rick, he'll tell you more. You talk to Tina, he'll tell you more. You take the people who are active in the ministries here. Well, I know we have this need. All right. If you don't have anybody else to talk to like that, you walk out your door and you start to be observant as you walk around. Well, why is that? Why is that? Why is that? And so what can I do to help be part of fixing that? Read your local newspaper. A lot of people don't get the newspaper, but you can read them all online, and you'll read a lot of controversies in the newspapers, and you'll read a lot of events to go to. Then how do I get involved? Go to events. There's a Native American powwow in Davis today. You go them and you learn about the cultural customs of the tribes. It's a celebration you learn about. You're welcome to go and respectfully attend, but it's a good way to know and at least know about things. In Sonoma County, the Pomo tribe there is having its annual spring celebration at Armstrong Woods State Park today. It's a glorious thing to go to, and you really get what spring's all about. It's not just, oh, the tulips and daffodils come out, but it's all about new life and so forth. So you'll learn about different cultures by going to those things. There's a lot of Latino festivals around. There's Asian American festivals going around. There's MLK Day celebrations to go to. Go to those things. Learn about your cultures. Start to meet people. Starting to see how you can get involved. Join an organization. Join a nonprofit that focuses on these different cultural groups and people of color that you feel a heartthrob about. If you're interested in the criminal justice system, get involved in Restorative Justice Coalition. You look that up. There's scores of agencies in Sacramento County and surrounding counties that work on restorative justice and help to fix the public safety criminal justice system. You can find something if you just go out and look. Join an organization, advocate, get involved. And before you know it, you will be involved, and you'll be standing up here and trying to help other people figure out how to get involved like I'm doing right now. So thank you for that, and I look forward to seeing you out in the streets, advocating and holding signs, and Miriam's going to close us out for this session.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, as followers of Jesus, we're called to bring God's love into our communities and our churches and to build the beloved community. It's a big call. It's a big commitment. It invites us to step outside of our comfort zones because we're doing things maybe we haven't done before. But we need to do that in order to address systems of injustice in our communities. So what does it take? It takes courage. It does. It takes courage to do these things. At the revival, there are going to be several opportunities for you to learn more about how to be courageous and to build the beloved community. One of the speakers is Reverend Canon Stephanie Spellers. Are any of you going to the revival? Okay, some of you are. That's good. She's going to be doing a workshop on becoming beloved community where you are. And she's going to be inspiring us all with her message about opportunities to be active, striving for justice and peace in our communities and churches. There will also be a Season of Courage exhibit at the revival that will share stories of real people in our diocese, clergy and lay, people like us, and what they've done, what we've done to step out into our communities and to engage, to be messengers of love and to be healers. So I invite you to visit the exhibit, to learn about those stories, and to think about, okay, what can I do? What is the Spirit calling me to do that maybe I've been ignoring? What am I hearing, and where am I being called? If you'd like more in-depth information about our workshops, I'm happy to respond to your questions. Bob's here, Karen, Joanne, Kathy, Tina, trainers. We'd be happy to share information with you about that. And again, folks, it's about answering God's call to be more loving, to be more loving. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miriam.
Sorry, we took something.
Before you run away, Miriam,
Oh.
come back.
Yes. Yes.
Are there any questions for
Oh.
Miriam or Bob? We had a formal Q&A session built in, but we're
Okay.
a little behind schedule, and we've been doing questions after each one. So if there are any questions, but
Okay, thank you.
yeah, if you didn't hear that, the powwow was canceled because of the rain. I was wondering about that myself. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, again, thank you so much for that very informative
Thank you.
presentation and taking it from history to what we can do today. So we have one more thing in our program, which is the litany of social penance. We are a church group, so we tend to pray ourselves out. So if you did not pick it up, who needs one? Can you pass those out? And then after we do that, there will be more time to talk to Bill, to eat more food. Again, we're an Episcopal church, coffee, food, we're good. And Bill's books are available, as I say. I think we have, at my house, we have a section of the Bill books, you know. They're great. And that one neighborhood that Bill talked about, Boulevard Park, that's where I live. In a house that predates Boulevard Park, when it was part of the agricultural exhibit. A seed merchant owned my house. Okay. And it's front and back, by the way. Let us pray. O God, our Creator, who has made us your human children as one family in you, so that what concerns any must concern all. We confess the evils we have done and the good we have left undone. We have spent our strength too often upon the town of Babel of our own pride. We have forgotten that the city's foundations, builder and maker is you. We have been content that we ourselves should prosper, though many might be poor, that a few should feast while multitudes were famished, both in body and in soul. O you who taught us that whatever we sow, that we shall also reap. Help us to repent before your judgment comes. For the clouded eyes that see no further than our own advantage. For the dulled imagination that does not know what others suffer. For willingness to profit by injustice, which we have not striven to prevent. For the selfishness that is quick to gain and slow to give. for the unconcern that makes us cry. I am my brother's keeper. O you who are ever merciful, take away the evil of our conscious and unconscious. Forgive us our unfaithfulness to the vision of your kingdom, and grant us to a better purpose for the days to come. For acquiescence in old iniquities, from indifference to the human cost of anything we covet, from the greed that wastes the lives of men and women through unemployment, poverty, and deprivation, from the cruelty that exploits the needy and defenseless, from the blasphemy against the spirit that sells bodies and souls of children to the golden idols of success, from false leadership in business and in government, and above all, from feebleness in the people that lets false leaders rise to power. Unless the Lord builds the house, but the one who sits upon the throne said, even so, O God, let your redemptive purpose work through us to build a new and better world for the glory of your name and the blessing of your people, and through Jesus Christ our Lord. For some deeper dives, if you are interested for things to do for the rest of the day, on the back of the agenda we have several recommendations for places you can visit, the California Museum, the History Museum, Sutter's Fort, and the State Indian Museum, which are all relatively close to this building, and also some restaurants if for some reason you're hungry. And with that, Tina, as the deacon, would you just, oh, you have it, you have something, okay. Quick.
Kathy, Joanne, the folks who, thought I turned it
Oh,
on.
yeah, okay.
Oh, gotta keep it here, right? So whoever helped put this together, please stand up. So I know Reverend Kathy over here, Joanne. We also have Karen and Tina to our presenters as well, Bob and Miriam. Also William, please. And Rick for your hospitality
Thank
too
you.
and your presentation. Just on behalf of the diocese and our Fearless Faith Revival team, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. As the resident deacon in the house, would you please dismiss us? Thanks be to God. And again, thank you all on behalf of St. Paul's. It was a joy to host you.